Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have Sarah Cole with me. Why? Because I'm in for a treat, which means you're in for a treat. Sarah, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Tom. It's great to be here.
So, we do have at least one thing in common, which is we are recovering lawyers. So,
Yeah.
with that, tell us about your professional background and your journey to founding Integrity First Coaching and Cole Forums.
Wow. Okay. So, like you, yes, I am a solicitor in the UK. My career began doing litigation. I did some corporate work. I think I got into the law because, quite naively, I think, in hindsight, I thought I was going to be seeking justice and helping people through difficult times. I I realized quite quickly that wasn't the case, but I had invested so much in getting there, if you like, because my dad hadn't supported me, didn't really think I should go to uni. And I'd worked my derriere off to get there. So I think I would have carried on blindly as a lawyer. But I had a very serious car accident in 2004, just over 20 years ago. And it was a huge turning point for me. During my recovery, I took sort of what I thought would be a 6-month role, just doing something else so that I could recover because it was such a stressful job. And I discovered events basically, and I ran legal events. And unexpectedly, that just became my gateway into something really quite transformative. It's a bit sort of cliched, but I did find my calling, I think, which was essentially bringing people together. I just love people. And I went on to spend 15 years doing exactly that for legal and compliance professionals. I engaged with all sorts of senior leaders in business, the judiciary, celebrities, law, compliance, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And probably would never have left, but for the fact that one of my great sponsors and supporters, Susan Divers, who I know you know as well, Tom, said to me, hey, why don't you come and work for my company, LRN? And the more I looked into the company, the more fascinated I became with the idea of, I guess, more of a mission with a business than the other way around, and having a purpose in life. And against all my family's great advice, with my 5-year-old in tow as a single mum, I threw in my really rather good job with events and my pension and everything else. And I did something completely different. And I worked on training and operationalizing values. And it meant that I was able to completely immerse myself in the world of compliance and ethics, which I'd enjoyed delivering events on. So I sort of got a kick out of helping companies embed their values into behaviors and decisions. And actually, my personal experiences around, say, bullying, retaliation, and sort of witnessing somewhat failed cultures, which many law firms certainly then were victim of, I think, really made me see the value in what I was doing. And I absolutely loved it. And then after about 10 years of working with that company and then later on looking at more risk from a consultancy perspective, I looked back at all the people I'd met, all the leaders and chief ethics and compliance officers, general counsel who'd become friends over the years. And I realized they really lacked a safe space for, I suppose, speaking openly and confidentially about the decisions they were facing on a daily basis. It was like a recurring theme that they felt isolated. They didn't have these trusted spaces to speak candidly without the reputational risk that always involves. And so I sort of thought about my events experience and my knowledge around these challenges. And I decided to launch Cole Forums, which is essentially peer support groups. So small curated groups of CEOs or general counsel, chief ethics and compliance officers and other executives, usually around 12 people, up to 15. And it's just been gold because those relationships they're building in these peer support groups are built on trust, their shared wisdom, their connection, all the things that right back at the beginning of my long-winded response, I meant to do when I became a lawyer. So there it is.
So what do you think it's like to be at that CEO level? Is that an isolating experience for many people? Or, and of course, I want to lead into what's the power of peer support for senior execs or even just the exec?
I think leadership has become ever more complex. I think it was Deloitte that recently shared a survey where 70% of senior leaders reported having burnout symptoms. And I think leadership has become ever more important in really difficult circumstances. We've got unprecedented geopolitical volatility, cultural division, regulatory shifts, rapid technological disruption, especially around AI. And I think that role is actually such a burden for those who are in it. Not that the excitement of being an entrepreneur and leading isn't still there, but I think the reality of translating that into everyday decisions is lonely. Yeah, really isolating. I think the idea as well that CEOs are now impacting on society with their decisions. There was an Endelman Trust Barometer, which said that 79% of people trust their employers more than the government or the media at the moment. So there's an incredible responsibility around that for leaders. And there's a real cost to that, I think.
So the group of Cole forums, it strike me it's a safe place for CEOs or other leaders to share, but it's much more than that. It's a place where they can actually ask honest questions and get honest feedback, perhaps in a way they couldn't in a more open setting, or even if they tried to pick up a phone and call someone. How much or even more does the forum bring to someone beyond simply letting them talk to peers?
I think most of us have got some sort of support around us, anyone. It can be your partner, it can be a family, and in work, we might have colleagues. But truthful feedback, that's more rare, especially informed truthful feedback, because obviously your partner might give you truthful feedback, but they might not be fully aware of the nuances of the commercial things that you're faced with. And leaders, let's be honest, are often surrounded by people who just agree with them or defer to them. And what the forums are giving them are truthful feedback, safe challenge, even perspective, which they mightn't get from family members, from people who've just been there and done it. And there's a saying I absolutely love, which is why reinvent the wheel. And I think when other people have been faced with things, I'll give you an example. A CEO in one of the groups was about to give some sort of public response. I've got to think about confidentiality here, but basically he was about to respond to something publicly that had been said by his organization. And others in the group really counseled against the particular path that he or she intended to follow. And I think it would have been really quite publicly harmful had he gone ahead with it. But it was only in the safety of that group that he was able to raise it. So I think it's absolutely gold for those involved in it. And I really think the world, and whether that's called forums or another type of forum where you can really share and absorb wisdom from your peers, is absolutely essential.
I have a podcast on leadership. And one of the reasons I started the podcast was because growing up, particularly in law firms, I always thought you were either born a leader or you weren't. And didn't mean you had to be a worker bee. You could be a very good lawyer. You just weren't a leader. And I came to realize that was not correct. And so how do you really help business people understand the human side of leadership? And in many ways, that may be more important than a strategic vision or even technical competency.
I think you've kind of struck, we've spoken before, Tom, and I know there are synergies in our approach. But for me, the reason I started my podcast on leadership was exactly to drive the other elements of leadership, other than the stereotypical ones, the conversation around those elements. I've had people like Dame Sally Gunnell, who's an incredible Grand Slam athletics high achiever. I've had Alison Taylor. I've had Martin Wolf, who's the chief economist for the Financial Times. And they're all looking at different aspects of leadership because it is so complex and there are so many elements to it: business, family, personal. It's about taking leadership to the next level. So not just strategy, but purpose, recovery, accountability, all the things that I think wrap up to make the best leaders. And we all want to be, as leaders, the best leaders we can be. And what's so powerful, and I'd be interesting to hear what you think from your experience on your podcast, but is the authenticity of the guests for me. They don't posture, they really share. And there's this feeling that they want to help others achieve that. And it's just so lovely to get the feedback from listeners that they do feel less alone, more inspired, more equipped, whatever it is. And I'm bringing that to the forums because we always have a speaker and they can be talking about anything, very much like the podcast, different aspects, whether that's trust or family or what have you. So I think those elements is what I'm really striving to include in the conversation. And obviously the whole forum isn't about that, but it really sparks thought within the leaders that attend around things like trust. Paul Zak spoke about trust as a biological driver and that how we as humans are wired to cooperate and that how sometimes micromanaging people can stifle that instinct. I thought that was so interesting because it's something many leaders do find themselves doing, the micromanaging piece. So yeah, and that sparks huge conversation. And that's the bit I love. I'm on fire when that's happening in the forum because that's what it's all about. Because once you're sparking a debate, then you're getting feedback from those people in the group. So yeah, it's a very cool thing to do.
Certainly in the state of Texas, there's a lot of discussion around emotional and mental health for lawyers. Our state bar has several very good programs that I've been involved with over the years. Are there those same types of supports for business leaders? And conversely, how do you help a business leader understand that their own mental and emotional health have to be paramount for them to be a successful leader?
Tom, you've hit on a real problem, I think. And look, I can only speak for the UK and Europe, but yeah, it's an issue. The support network, I don't think is there. And more than that, there is a real vulnerability around asking for help that leaders don't naturally expose themselves to, in my experience. Sally Gunnell, that Olympian that I was just sharing about, she said that her Olympic success wasn't just about pushing harder, doing better, although it was obviously a lot of those things, but it was about knowing when to rest and recover. And she really highlighted that people, particularly leaders, should be treating recovery as strategically important as the performance itself. So self-care and all the things that certainly there's a propensity in the leaders I've spoken to put themselves last because their organization's success and all the metrics that the board are looking for take paramount importance, and they often take a back seat. And I don't think you can be the best leader you can be or do your organization justice unless you do put that time and energy into taking care of your own needs. Mental health particularly will suffer if you don't. So yeah, peer support hopefully will be it. The groups are partly doing that for each other. And I don't think there's a better substitute, to be honest.
Earlier in the podcast, you spoke about several of the challenges leaders face today because of regulatory complexity, geopolitical uncertainty, technological shifts. pandemics, weather, whatever it may be. And what I wanted to ask is, does this put more pressure on business leaders, or is it just a level of speeding up of the decisions that we may have made 20 or even 10 years ago?
It's a good question. I think that good leadership is evolving definitely from the sort of more traditional command and control to a coach and co-create. But that's brings its own pressures because you need ethical and emotional intelligence and agility. You need the ability to navigate paradox. And you're judged not just by your performance, but by your integrity, which you absolutely should be. But I think that transparency that technology and the sort of fast-paced roles that leaders are faced with now in terms of decision making and those pressures that we talked about, geopolitical and otherwise, I think the best leaders that I've come across are recognizing that they do need to step up in those areas, but they're also viewing themselves more as stewards. So they want to empower others. They want to build resilient cultures. And often they want to leave a more meaningful legacy as well. So it's almost like they're appreciating their role is more about how they look after their teams, their organizations, rather than lead in a more traditional sense. So things like vulnerability are more applauded than ever they have been. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but it leads to another question. We are starting to have the discussion in America along the lines of, do CEOs have a right to a private life? Within the past couple of weeks, we had a major CEO from an apparel company was terminated for not so much an inappropriate relationship, although that I'm sure had some factor, but he sent business to this person who he'd had the relationship with, and that was deemed an ethical violation. But it's led to this question of, do CEOs have the right to a personal life, or is everything they do so important? Is that a discussion that is going on in the United Kingdom or in the EU? And that's got to add a completely different level of pressure and complexity to what you have to help coach these people through.
So on the face of it, no. I don't think there are any specific cases that have blown up in the press of late. However, Professor David Grayson on the podcast talked about the necessity for leaders to have clarity around their personal values and their ethical commitments. And I think his thinking around that was that it is very visible now being in that role from the public's perspective. And so you need to sort of have real commitment to your values in order to be successful as a leader. And indeed, Klaus Moosmeyer, who's the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of Novartis, also said that leaders can sometimes overestimate the trust that they build in their organizations, and that genuine trust is more around being, I suppose, or acknowledging the bias that they might have in terms of that trust. So I do think there's a recognition that public persona and their personal persona needs to be one, because unfortunately, by becoming a CEO of a large multinational, whether that's headquartered in the US or the UK, I think you have every awareness that you are in the public eye. And yes, to follow on with your point about the support that necessarily need, the psychological safety of being in the group that is confidential can open up conversations around that pressure, the additional pressure of the public perception of your persona as well. It's hard. I think the reward for being a CEO has been evident for decades in terms of financial and feeling successful and accomplishment in growing a business, say. but it's so complex. And I said that at the beginning of our conversation, Tom, it's ever more complex.
Used a phrase, or you have used a phrase I was not aware of, and that's decision fatigue. Could you explain what that is and how you might help someone work through issues relating to decision fatigue?
Yeah, I don't want to generalize too much, but I think something that I've observed, I suppose, through running the forums and just my interaction with leaders for 30 years is that decision fatigue comes from basically the burden of having too many decisions on your leadership. And what that has generally stemmed from, I would say, is sometimes a failure to delegate properly, or maybe the business is in a more of a crisis state than a sort of smooth running state, and therefore there are more minutiae details to be dealing with. But a lot of it, I think, stems from not having the right team in place. And one of the things Richard Barrett, who's also on the podcast, was talking about was the need to have evolved a good team, to delegate accurately, to, I suppose, mirror your consciousness as a leader in your team and in your culture. And I think there are ways in which your peers in the format of the forum can really help with that decision fatigue, because 9 times out of 10, they've been in that place, whether it's in a crisis point in their own organization, or perhaps they themselves haven't delegated adequately to team members in the past. And I feel it's not a magic wand, but it really helps people through the thought process of how they might alleviate that fatigue. So yeah, I think and this is why I'm so passionate about peer support, because I've seen it in action and I've seen how critical it is in bringing people to become the best leader they can possibly be, so that they're not burdened by decision fatigue, so that they're not faced with mental health issues because they've taken on too much and they don't have that sort of rest and recovery that we were talking about. It's really important.
What is purpose-driven leadership, and why do you say it's even more important in 2025?
Well, I think, look, I've many books on my shelf about purpose and why it's so important. Personally, I took the role with LRN because I believed that LRN was then led by a purpose-driven man, Dev Seidman, incredible passion around his subject. And it was absolutely contagious. If you were with LRN, you definitely wanted to be part of a business with a purpose. And I think what I've observed, again, looking back over these 20, 30 years, is that this has become more and more important for millennials, for generations behind millennials. It's become critical. And we're hearing now that people are actually looking at organizations' purpose before they're even thinking about whether they want to work with them, because that's what they are seeking. So as a leader, once again, you're burdened with thinking about your talent that's coming through in your organization, which is obviously key. And I'm hearing all the time that this is a real issue for companies. And so you have to be alive to it. But the sort of irony of that is it's not something that you can just decide one day, I'm going to be part of a purpose-driven organization and lead a purpose-driven organization. You've got to feel it. You've got to live it. That's the whole point, right? It's purpose-driven. So I think whilst I'm seeing a trend towards organizations that flourish and thrive when they've got purpose, leaders, I think, just fall by the wayside if they haven't got it these days. Because to have that passion, and I know you've got it, Tom, for what you do, somehow that's become part of the DNA of good leadership now. And I think it will be into the future. If I had my crystal ball, I think it will become more purpose and values driven.
Sarah, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to ask before we leave if anyone wanted to connect with you, find out more information about Coal Forums, or listen to your podcast, Insights from the Coalface, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
Well, first and foremost is the website. It's very easy, www.coleforums.com. And also you can follow me on LinkedIn, Sarah Cole. But Insights from the Coal Face is on all of the normal podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon. And I would love to see people join me there. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Tom.
Sarah, it's been an absolute delight.
Thank you.